So finally we get to talk about audit evidence. We've been working our way through Chapter 5, working through a discussion about assertions and procedures that collect audit evidence. So now let's actually talk about what is good audit evidence. So audit evidence is the information used by the auditor to arrive at the conclusions on which the audit opinion is based. So in order to even give an audit opinion, auditors have to test specific management assertions, and we do that through specific audit procedures that provide us with specific types of evidence on whether or not each relevant assertion is supported. Okay, so auditors cannot provide an audit opinion without sufficient and appropriate audit evidence, and the only way to get there is by understanding what assertions are at stake and doing procedures to determine whether or not those assertions are supported. Okay, so what do I mean by sufficient and appropriate audit evidence? Sufficient audit evidence is a measurement of the quantity of our audit evidence. How much do we have? And this is a function of the risk of material misstatement, inherent risk times control risk, we learned in Chapter 4, the level of materiality, and evidence appropriateness. Okay, so what is the relationship between sufficiency of evidence and the risk of material misstatement? It's a direct relationship. So the higher my risk of material misstatement is, the greater a chance that there's going to be a misstatement in the financial statements, the more evidence I need to demonstrate that the financial statements are fairly stated. Lower risk of material misstatement, smaller amount of evidence needed. When it comes to materiality, though, there's an inverse relationship. The higher my level of materiality, the more wiggle room that I have, the less evidence that I need to demonstrate financial statements are fairly stated. If I have a really small materiality level, meaning very little wiggle room, I need to be very accurate, then I need a lot of evidence. And then evidence appropriateness, which is the next characteristic of evidence I'll break down on the next slide. The higher quality it is, appropriateness relates to the quality of evidence, then the less I need of it. Okay, so higher quality meaning I need less quantity. So there's an inverse relationship there. However, if it's poor quality evidence, then I need more of it to make me as an auditor feel comfortable that the financial statements are fairly stated. Okay, so the appropriateness of audit evidence is a measurement of the quality of evidence. And as we've already talked about actually in class, this relates to evidence that is both relevant and reliable. Okay, evidence is appropriate when it is both relevant and reliable, meaning when it's relevant, it's relating to the assertion and the account that I'm testing. It provides me with information about that assertion. If it's reliable, then we're talking about the specific source of that information. Where did it come from? Can I trust it? And the more trustworthy that source is, the more reliable the information and evidence actually is. Okay, so what are some reliable sources? What are some sources in general of evidence? If I have documentary evidence versus oral evidence, documents being I can actually look at an invoice, and oral evidence is somebody just tells me that it is something. Well, documentary evidence is significantly more reliable than somebody's word. Now we do inquiry, and I talked about how we have to do that, but we have to corroborate that inquiry with something. I can't just believe what management says. I need to ask them for some documentation. When I was working, if I saw an unusual fluctuation in a particular account, I would talk to the manager about that, but then I would ask for specific invoices to demonstrate that this expense actually increased, and why, to corroborate their explanation. Effectiveness of internal control. What can I look at there? Well, if I just observe somebody doing the internal control, can I determine that it's really effective? Probably not. I need to re-perform it. I need to do some inspection. I need to see signatures belonging where they actually belong. If I obtain the evidence from a third party versus an internal source, that third party evidence is a lot more reliable. So a confirmation mailed to me directly is better than something I obtain from inside. It doesn't mean that we never obtain something from the inside, because sometimes that's the only place to get it. It just means that if I can get it from the outside, that's better. Auditor generated evidence is a lot more reliable than internally generated evidence from the client. Okay, so this is why auditors go observe controls. They observe the inventory count so that they can have that firsthand experience. And originals are always better than copies or duplicates. So if I can have the original, then I know for sure that it's not fake. And so how do we collect that higher quality evidence? How does that integrate in with those types of audit procedures? Well, Table 5.6 shows you a range, right? Higher quality or more reliable evidence comes from procedures where I'm inspecting as the auditor. Okay, I'm seeing something with my own eyes. I am reperforming that procedure myself. I'm recalculating and crunching those numbers. Lower quality evidence at the other extreme is observation and inquiry. They can tell me whatever they want, right? And I might believe it, but it could be false. If I sit and watch somebody do the control, they're probably going to do it the way they should when I'm watching as an auditor, but they may not always do it that way. So that's lower quality evidence, which is why we need corroboration. And then somewhere in the middle would be the inspection of records or documents. So of course, I could get a sales invoice and match it to a shipping document and customer order, but it could be that those are falsified. So generally they are reliable, but there is always that risk. Confirmation is more reliable. It is a third-party source, but again, it could also be contaminated. So again, auditors just have to consider that risk. Analytical procedures, again, we're using information that we know and expectations that we have. And so if our expectations are incorrect, then of course that's going to be less reliable. And then scanning, we didn't really talk about that particular procedure, but that's when I'm reviewing things as an auditor, scanning the journal entries. And usually that's very reliable. But again, if I'm given something that's contaminated, then it's hard to know whether or not it's actually contaminated. And so it's not the most reliable type of audit evidence. But that just gives you an idea of how we get good evidence through our procedures, and then which procedures provide us with less reliable evidence and what we can do to help kind of bolster those pieces of evidence up. Okay, well, you're probably wondering, when is enough enough? And we've talked about determining whether we have sufficient appropriate audit evidence really is determined by the auditor's professional judgment. And while it is a risk, a factor of the risk of material misstatement, the materiality level, and appropriateness, there's really no one-to-one relationship between assertions and audit procedures. Auditors just have to sit down and consider all of the risks that are present, what management has done to mitigate those risks, and what is the most effective and efficient way for them to respond to gain evidence to provide reasonable assurance on the financial statements. And it's important also to consider that auditors cannot exclude an audit procedure solely due to cost, but you have to consider the cost versus the benefit. Okay, so I could sit and collect 100% evidence on an account that I'm concerned with. However, that would be very costly and not sure that it would provide me with as much benefit as it would cost. Okay, so we can't just not do something because it's too expensive, but anything that we do, and especially extended procedures, we need to consider, all right, what evidence is this going to give me? How much is this going to help my opinion relative to the cost that it will take to get me there?